Sarah Martinez pushed through the glass doors of Westfield Shopping Center on a sunny Tuesday afternoon. Her mind focused on a simple mission that had nothing to do with military operations or life-threatening situations. After 2 decades of serving her country as one of the few women to complete Navy SEAL training, she was finally adjusting to civilian life, and today's objective was refreshingly mundane: find a decent outfit for her sister's wedding next weekend. The transition from active duty to civilian life had been harder than any mission she'd completed in the Middle East. For 20 years, every day had begun with purpose, structure, and the knowledge that her actions could mean the difference between life and death for her teammates. Now, at 42, she found herself navigating grocery stores instead of hostile territories, dealing with traffic jams instead of enemy fire, and try to remember what normal people worried about when they weren't responsible for national security. Her military service had started when she was barely 22, fresh out of college with a degree in mechanical engineering, and a burning desire to prove that gender was irrelevant when it came to protecting America. The Navy SEAL program had just begun accepting women on a trial basis, and Sarah was among the first 12 to attempt the grueling selection process. Only she and one other woman had made it through Hell Week, and only Sarah had completed the entire program. The years that followed were a blur of classified missions, endless training, and the constant pressure of being a pioneer in a field where failure wasn't just personal. It reflected on every woman who might follow in her footsteps. She had served in Afghanistan, Iraq, Somalia, and places that didn't officially exist on any government documents. She had killed when necessary, saved lives when possible, and earned the respect of men who initially questioned whether a woman belonged in their brotherhood. But those days were behind her now. 3 months ago, she had completed her 20-year commitment and decided not to re-enlist. The decision hadn't been easy. The military was all she had known for her entire adult life, and the skills that made her exceptional in combat didn't translate easily to civilian employment. She was currently working as a security consultant for a private firm, a job that paid well, but felt hollow compared to the purpose-driven missions of her military career. Her apartment in downtown Seattle was sparse, furnished with the minimal belongings of someone who had spent 2 decades living out of duffel bags and temporary barracks. The walls were bare except for a single framed photograph of her SEAL team and a folded American flag that had been presented to her during her retirement ceremony. She owned 3 changes of civilian clothes, all purchased hastily during her first week of freedom, which brought her to today's shopping expedition. The department store was busier than she had expected for a Tuesday afternoon. Families with young children wandered between the racks. Teenagers tried on clothes while their parents waited impatiently, and elderly couples moved slowly through the aisles, taking their time to examine every item. Sarah felt overwhelmed by the choices and the chaos. In the military, clothing decisions were simple: uniforms for duty, PT gear for training, dress blues for ceremonies. Choosing between dozens of dresses, each in multiple colors and sizes, felt more challenging than planning a tactical assault. She selected several conservative dresses that seemed appropriate for a wedding and headed toward the changing rooms at the back of the store. The area was quieter than the main shopping floor, with a long hallway lined with individual fitting rooms on both sides. A bored-looking teenager sat behind a small desk at the entrance, half-heartedly checking the number of items each customer carried and handing out plastic number tags. Sarah showed her selection to the girl, who barely looked up from her phone as she handed over a tag marked with the number 6. The changing room area stretched back further than she had expected, with the lighting becoming dimmer as the hallway continued toward the rear of the store. She found room 6 near the end of the corridor, far from the entrance and isolated from most of the other customers. As she hung the dresses on the hooks inside the small cubicle, Sarah's trained instincts automatically cataloged the environment around her. The changing room was approximately 6 feet by 4 feet, with a single door that locked from the inside, but could easily be forced from the outside. The walls were thin, offering no real barrier if someone wanted to break through. There was no security camera visible, and the nearest store employee was at least 50 yards away at the entrance to the changing area. Under normal circumstances, these observations would have been automatic but irrelevant. Sarah wasn't on a mission, wasn't in hostile territory, and had no reason to expect trouble in a suburban department store. But 20 years of military training had made situational awareness as natural as breathing, and she couldn't turn it off even when buying clothes for a family wedding. She began trying on the first dress, a navy blue number that her sister had suggested would complement her complexion. As she adjusted the straps and examined herself in the small mirror, she heard voices in the hallway outside. Male voices, which was unusual since the changing rooms were supposed to be separated by gender. She paused, listening carefully to their conversation. She went down this way. One voice said, speaking quietly, but not quietly enough to escape Sarah's enhanced hearing. "Room 6. You sure she's alone?" asked a second voice, deeper and rougher than the first. "Yeah, man. Been watching her for 20 minutes. She's by herself, parked way out in the back lot." Perfect setup. Sarah's blood chilled as she realized they were talking about her. Her mind immediately shifted from civilian mode to combat readiness, a transformation that happened as naturally as flipping a switch. Every nerve in her body became alert, every muscle tense for action, every sense heightened to maximum sensitivity. She remained perfectly still, continuing to listen as the voices grew closer to her changing room door. There were definitely 2 of them, possibly more. They had been watching her, which meant this wasn't random. They had followed her into the store, observed her movements, and waited for her to isolate herself in this back corner of the changing area. "Remember, keep it quiet," the first voice continued. "In and out, no witnesses." "What about cameras?" "None back here. I checked when I cased the place yesterday." The conversation confirmed Sarah's worst fears. This was a planned attack, and they had chosen their location carefully. The back of the changing room area was isolated from store security, hidden from cameras, and far enough from other customers that screams might not be heard over the general noise of the busy store. She quickly but silently began putting her street clothes back on, her movements efficient and practiced. In the military, the ability to dress and undress quickly had been essential for rapid deployment situations, and the skill served her well now. As she pulled on her jeans and t-shirt, she considered her options. Running wasn't feasible. They were between her and the only exit from the changing room area, and she had no idea how many accomplices might be waiting elsewhere in the store or parking lot. The changing room itself offered no defensive advantages. It was a trap waiting to be sprung. Fighting was the only viable option, but she needed to control the circumstances. If she waited for them to force entry into the changing room, she would be confined in a space too small for effective movement. Better to take the initiative and engage them on her terms. Sarah opened her purse and checked its contents. No weapons, of course. She wasn't carrying anything that might be useful in combat. But her hands themselves were weapons, registered with the military as lethal instruments after 2 decades of close-quarters combat training. Her body was a weapon, conditioned and trained for exactly this type of situation. The voices had stopped, which meant they were probably positioning themselves outside her door. She could hear the soft shuffling of feet, the whisper of clothing against skin, the barely audible sound of someone testing the door handle. She took a deep breath, centering herself the way she had been taught in countless training sessions. Fear was natural, even beneficial. It sharpened reflexes and increased strength. But panic was the enemy, and Sarah Martinez had never panicked, not when Taliban fighters had overrun her position in Afghanistan, not when her helicopter had been shot down in Iraq, and not now when 2 predators thought they had cornered helpless prey. The door handle turned slowly, and Sarah realized they were coming in whether she was ready or not. She positioned herself to the side of the door, out of the immediate line of sight from anyone entering the room. Her weight was balanced on the balls of her feet, her hands loose and ready, her mind calculating angles of attack and vulnerable points on the human body. 20 years of training had prepared her for this moment, though she had never imagined it would come in a department store changing room. As the door began to open, Sarah Martinez, former Navy SEAL, combat veteran, and guardian of American freedom, prepared to remind 2 criminals why predators should be very careful about choosing their prey. The first man stepped through the doorway, and Sarah's civilian life officially ended. Her military training took over, and she became once again what she had always been, one of the most dangerous human beings on the planet, ready to do whatever was necessary to survive and protect herself from those who would do her harm. The battle was about to begin, and despite being outnumbered and trapped in a confined space, Sarah Martinez had never felt more confident about the outcome. These men had made the mistake of their lives, and she was about to teach them why some people should never be underestimated. The first man who stepped through the changing room door was exactly what Sarah had expected. Mid-30s, approximately 6 feet tall, wearing dark clothing and moving with the casual confidence of someone who believed he held all the advantages. Behind him, she could see the shadow of his partner, slightly shorter but broader through the shoulders. Both men carried themselves like predators who had done this before. "Step away," Sarah warned, her voice calm and clear despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. The words were spoken quietly, but carried an undertone of authority that had commanded respect from hardened warriors in combat zones around the world. The first attacker smiled at her warning, interpreting her calm demeanor as fear or shock. He couldn't have been more wrong. In his experience, victims either screamed, cried, or froze when confronted. Sarah's controlled response was so far outside his understanding that he dismissed it as irrelevant. "Relax, sweetheart," he said, stepping fully into the changing room. "This will be over quick if you don't fight it." His partner moved into the doorway behind him, effectively blocking any escape route. Both men were focused on what they perceived to be an easy target, a small woman alone in a confined space with nowhere to run. They had no idea they were looking at someone who had spent 20 years learning how to kill efficiently and without hesitation. "I'm warning you one more time," Sarah said, maintaining her position against the side wall of the changing room. "Walk away now, and nobody gets hurt." The second man laughed at her words. "Nobody gets hurt? Lady, you're not in any position to be making threats." Sarah studied both attackers with the analytical mindset of a military tactician. The first man was nervous despite his confident words. She could see it in the way his hands trembled slightly and how his eyes darted around the small space. He was the follower, probably recruited for this job by his partner. The second man was calmer, more experienced, and clearly the leader of this operation. He would be the primary threat. "Last chance," Sarah said, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. The first man reached toward her, and Sarah's 20 years of combat training exploded into action. Her left hand shot out with lightning speed, grabbing his wrist and twisting it at an angle that immediately sent waves of excruciating pain up his arm. At the same time, her right elbow drove into his solar plexus with enough force to completely empty his lungs. The combination of moves was executed so quickly that he didn't have time to react or even understand what was happening to him. As the first attacker doubled over in pain and struggled to breathe, Sarah used his body as a pivot point to launch herself at the second man. Her right foot connected with his knee with surgical precision, targeting the exact spot where his patella met the joint. The sound of cartilage separating was audible even over his scream of agony. The second man staggered backward into the hallway, his leg no longer capable of supporting his weight. Sarah followed him, maintaining her advantage by staying inside his reach where his superior size became a disadvantage rather than an asset. Her hands moved in a blur of controlled violence, striking nerve clusters and pressure points with the expertise of someone who had studied human anatomy from the perspective of how to disable it most effectively. "Please," the second man gasped, trying to raise his hands and surrender. "We weren't going to hurt you." Sarah's expression didn't change as she continued her assault. In combat, mercy was a luxury that could get you killed, and she treated this situation exactly like combat. These men had made their choice when they decided to attack her, and now they would face the consequences of underestimating their target. The first attacker was still struggling to breathe when Sarah turned her attention back to him. She grabbed him by the shirt and slammed him against the changing room wall with enough force to rattle the entire structure. His head snapped back and connected with the wall, leaving him dazed and barely conscious. "You picked the wrong person," Sarah told him, her voice still eerily calm despite the violence she had just unleashed. "I've killed better men than you with my bare hands." The entire encounter had lasted less than 30 seconds. Two men who had entered the changing room area as predators were now lying on the floor, one with a shattered knee and the other barely conscious from a concussion. Sarah stood over them, not even breathing heavily, as she assessed the situation and decided what to do next. Her military training told her to neutralize the threat completely. In combat, wounded enemies had a tendency to become problems later if they weren't dealt with permanently. But this wasn't a battlefield, and these men, despite their criminal intentions, were American civilians. She would have to handle the situation differently than she would have in Afghanistan or Iraq. The sound of approaching footsteps echoed from the front of the changing room area. Someone had apparently heard the commotion and was coming to investigate. Sarah quickly moved back into the changing room and began gathering her clothes and purse, preparing for the arrival of store security or other customers. "Help us," the second man whispered, his face pale with shock and pain. "Please, just call 911. Sarah looked down at him with the same expression she had worn when interrogating Taliban prisoners. "You wanted to hurt me," she said simply. "This is what happens when you try to hurt someone who can hurt you back." The footsteps were getting closer, accompanied by concerned voices. Sarah could hear someone calling for security and asking if everyone was okay. Within minutes, this area would be swarming with store personnel, police, and probably paramedics. She needed to prepare her story and decide how much of the truth she was willing to reveal. Her military service record was classified at the highest levels. Most of her missions had never officially happened, and her training was considered a national security asset. The last thing the Navy wanted was for one of their former SEALs to become involved in a civilian incident that would attract media attention and potentially compromise ongoing operations. But she also had no intention of being painted as the aggressor in this situation. These men had stalked her, planned to attack her, and gotten exactly what they deserved. If anything, she had shown remarkable restraint by not killing them both, which would have been the automatic response in any military situation. "Ma'am, are you all right?" A voice called from the entrance to the changing room area. "I'm fine," Sarah called back, stepping out of the changing room and looking down at the two men who were still struggling with their injuries. These gentlemen had an accident. The store security guard who arrived first took one look at the scene and immediately reached for his radio to call for police and medical assistance. The first attacker was sitting up but still struggling to breathe normally, while the second man was lying on his side, clutching his shattered knee and whimpering with each movement. "What happened here?" the security guard asked Sarah, his eyes taking in the obvious signs of violence. "These two men follow me into the changing room," Sarah explained calmly. "They had bad intentions. I defended myself." More store personnel were arriving, along with curious customers who had heard the commotion. Sarah found herself at the center of a growing crowd, all of whom seemed amazed that a woman her size could have inflicted such damage on two much larger men. "Lady, you really messed them up," one of the customers observed, staring at the injured attackers with a mixture of admiration and concern. Sarah didn't respond to the comment. She was focused on listening to the radio chatter from the security guard's equipment, trying to determine how much time she had before the police arrived. Once law enforcement became involved, her options would become much more limited. The first attacker, finally, managed to catch his breath enough to speak. "She attacked us," he wheezed, pointing an unsteady finger at Sarah. "We were just asking for directions." Sarah's expression didn't change, but she felt a familiar surge of anger at the lie. In combat situations, enemy prisoners often tried to manipulate their captors with false information or sob stories designed to gain sympathy. She had no patience for such tactics. "Directions to what?" Sarah asked, her voice carrying just enough edge to make the man reconsider his story. "You followed me to an isolated area and cornered me in a changing room. What directions were you looking for?" The man's eyes darted nervously between Sarah and the growing crowd of witnesses. He was clearly trying to think of a plausible explanation for his presence in the women's changing area, but his concussed brain wasn't functioning well enough to create a convincing lie. The sound of sirens could now be heard in the distance, growing louder as emergency vehicles approached the shopping center. Sarah knew that within minutes, she would be dealing with police officers, paramedics, and possibly detectives. The situation was about to become much more complicated. She had successfully defended herself against two attackers and done so without causing permanent injury or death. By any reasonable measure, she had handled the situation perfectly. But she also knew that explaining her actions would require revealing skills and training that were supposed to remain classified. As the sirens grew louder and the crowd around her continued to grow, Sarah Martinez prepared herself for the next phase of this encounter. The physical confrontation was over, but the bureaucratic battle was just beginning. She would need to convince law enforcement that her actions were justified without revealing the full extent of her capabilities or training. The two men on the floor represented more than just failed criminals. They were evidence of what happened when people made assumptions based on appearances, when predators chose their victims carelessly, and when 20 years of military training met civilian crime in a chance encounter that would change everyone involved forever. The first police officers to arrive at Westfield Shopping Center were patrol units responding to a call about an assault in progress. Officer Michael Chun had been a Seattle police officer for 12 years, and he thought he had seen everything the city had to offer in terms of violence and crime. But the scene that greeted him in the department store's changing room area was unlike anything in his experience. Two men were lying on the floor in obvious distress. The first, later identified as Marcus Webb, was sitting upright, but breathing in short, painful gasps and holding his side. The second, Derek Coleman, was lying on his side, clutching his knee and moaning loudly enough to be heard throughout the back section of the store. Both men showed clear signs of having been in a serious physical confrontation. Standing calmly nearby was a woman who appeared to be in her early 40s, of average height and build, wearing jeans and a simple t-shirt. She showed no signs of injury. Her clothing was undisturbed, and her breathing was completely normal. If not for the two injured men on the floor, Officer Chun would never have guessed she had been involved in any kind of altercation. "Ma'am, I'm Officer Chun with Seattle PD," he said, approaching Sarah with the cautious respect he had learned to show all potential witnesses. "Can you tell me what happened here?" Sarah had spent the 10 minutes before the police arrived preparing her statement. She knew that everything she said would be recorded, analyzed, and potentially used in court proceedings. More importantly, she knew that her military background would eventually come to light, and she needed to provide an explanation that was truthful without revealing classified information. "These two men followed me into the changing room area," Sarah explained, her voice steady and professional. "They cornered me in one of the rooms and made it clear they intended to assault me. I defended myself using the minimum force necessary to neutralize the threat." Officer Chun had been taking notes, but he stopped writing when Sarah used the phrase "neutralize the threat." In his experience, civilians didn't typically use such precise tactical language when describing personal defense situations. "Ma'am, what's your background?" Chun asked. "Military? Law enforcement. I served 20 years in the Navy," Sarah replied, providing just enough information to explain her capabilities without getting into specifics. "I retired 3 months ago." Meanwhile, the paramedics who had arrived with the police were examining the two attackers. The preliminary assessment wasn't good. Marcus Webb appeared to have several cracked ribs and was showing signs of concussion. Derek Coleman's knee was severely damaged, with what looked like torn ligaments and possibly a fractured patella. Both men would require immediate transport to the hospital for treatment. "Jesus," one of the paramedics muttered to his partner. Whoever did this knew exactly where to hit them. Detective Linda Rodriguez arrived 20 minutes after the initial patrol units. She was a 15-year veteran of the Seattle Police Department's Criminal Investigation Division, and she specialized in assault cases involving unusual circumstances. The initial report had described a situation where a small woman had successfully defended herself against two much larger male attackers, inflicting serious injuries in the process. "Officer Chun, what do we have here?" Detective Rodriguez asked as she surveyed the scene. "Attempted assault, ma'am." Two suspects cornered the victim in a changing room. She fought back and disabled both attackers. Victim claims military background, says she served 20 years in the Navy. Rodriguez studied Sarah with the analytical eye of an experienced investigator. Something about this situation didn't add up. The woman before her looked like a soccer mom, not a hardened military veteran. But the evidence suggested someone with extensive combat training had been involved. Mom, Detective Rodriguez. I need to ask you some questions about what happened here. Of course, Sarah replied. I'll cooperate fully with your investigation. Let's start from the beginning. What brought you to the store today? Sarah provided a detailed timeline of her afternoon, from her decision to shop for clothes for her sister's wedding to the moment she had warned the two men to step away. Her account was precise, chronological, and delivered with the kind of attention to detail that indicated either exceptional memory or extensive training in giving reports. When you say you warned them to step away, what exactly did you mean by that? Rodriguez asked. I gave them an opportunity to leave without anyone getting hurt, Sarah explained. I told them twice to walk away. They chose not to listen. And then what happened? Sarah's description of the physical confrontation was clinical and exact. She described each technique she had used, the anatomical targets she had struck, and the intended effect of each move. Her explanation sounded more like a military after-action report than a crime victim statement. Ma'am, what was your job in the Navy? Rodriguez asked, though she was beginning to suspect the answer would be more complicated than a simple job description. I served in special operations, Sarah replied carefully. Most of my service record is classified. Detective Rodriguez had interviewed enough military veterans to recognize when someone was being deliberately vague about their service. The phrase special operations could cover everything from clerical work in a specialized unit to the most elite combat forces in the American military. Did your training include hand-to-hand combat? Rodriguez asked. Yes. Extensive training? You could say that. While the detective was interviewing Sarah, the two attackers were being prepared for transport to Harborview Medical Center. Both men were conscious and able to speak, and they were loudly protesting their treatment as criminals rather than victims. She attacked us. Marcus Webb insisted to the paramedics, loading him into the ambulance. We were just asking for directions, and she went crazy on us. Derek Coleman was less coherent due to the pain from his injured knee, but he managed to tell anyone who would listen that they had been victims of an unprovoked assault by a crazy woman who obviously had mental problems. Detective Rodriguez made a note to interview both men once they were stable and able to provide detailed statements. But her preliminary assessment was that their version of events was highly unlikely. The physical evidence, witness statements from store employees and customers, and the location of the incident all supported Sarah's account. The store security footage was the next piece of evidence to examine. The shopping center had cameras throughout the main retail areas, but the changing room section was one of the few areas without direct surveillance for obvious privacy reasons. However, cameras at the entrance to the changing area had captured both men following Sarah and positioning themselves outside her changing room. Take a look at this. Officer Chun called Rodriguez over to view the security monitor. These guys definitely followed her. They waited outside her room for several minutes before making their move. The footage clearly showed both men loitering in the changing room area with no apparent purpose other than watching Sarah. When she entered room 6, they positioned themselves nearby and appeared to be waiting for the area to clear of other customers before approaching her door. This supports her story, Rodriguez concluded. They were stalking her, not asking for directions. Additional evidence came from interviews with store employees and customers who had witnessed parts of the incident. The teenager working at the changing room desk remembered both men asking which room the woman in the blue shirt had entered. Several customers reported seeing the two men hanging around the changing area for an unusually long time. But the most compelling evidence was the nature of the injuries themselves. Dr. James Patterson, the emergency room physician who treated both attackers, provided a medical assessment that raised even more questions about Sarah's background. Detective Rodriguez, I've been treating assault victims for 20 years, Dr. Patterson explained over the phone. These injuries are unusual. They're precise, targeted, and designed to disable rather than cause permanent damage. Whoever did this has extensive knowledge of human anatomy and combat techniques. What do you mean by precise? Rodriguez asked. The knee injury, for example. It's exactly the kind of strike that would immediately disable an opponent without causing life-threatening damage. The rib injuries are similar, painful and debilitating but not fatal. This wasn't random violence. This was someone applying specific techniques designed to neutralize threats efficiently. The medical evidence corroborated Sarah's claim of military training, but it also raised questions about exactly what kind of training she had received. Detective Rodriguez decided to dig deeper into Sarah's service record, though she suspected she would encounter significant obstacles due to the classified nature of Special Operations personnel files. Her first call was to the Navy Personnel Command in Millington, Tennessee. After being transferred through several departments and explaining the situation multiple times, she was finally connected to a liaison officer who handled inquiries about former Special Operations personnel. Detective Rodriguez, I can confirm that Sarah Martinez served 20 years in the Navy and was honorably discharged 3 months ago, the liaison officer explained. However, the specifics of her assignments and training are classified. I cannot provide details about her service record without authorization from higher authority. Can you tell me anything that might be relevant to this investigation? Rodriguez pressed. I can tell you that Ms. Martinez completed advanced combat training and served with distinction in multiple overseas deployments. Beyond that, you'll need to speak with someone who has clearance to discuss classified operations. The conversation confirmed what Rodriguez already suspected. Sarah Martinez was far more than just a Navy veteran. Her training and experience were classified at levels that suggested involvement in some of the most sensitive military operations conducted by the United States. By the end of the day, the evidence overwhelmingly supported Sarah's account of the incident. The security footage, witness statements, medical evidence, and physical evidence from the scene all indicated that she had been the victim of an attempted assault and had defended herself successfully. Marcus Webb and Derek Coleman would face charges of attempted assault, stalking, and conspiracy once they were released from the hospital. Their criminal records, which Detective Rodriguez discovered through routine background checks, showed previous arrests for similar crimes involving the targeting of women in retail locations. But Sarah Martinez presented a different kind of problem for the Seattle Police Department. She had clearly acted in self-defense, and no charges would be filed against her. However, her ability to inflict such precise and effective damage raised questions about whether civilian law enforcement was equipped to handle situations involving former Special Operations personnel. We need to be very careful about how we handle this, Detective Rodriguez told her supervisor that evening. This woman has capabilities that far exceed normal civilian self-defense training. If word gets out that a former Navy SEAL is living in Seattle, it could attract the wrong kind of attention. As the investigation concluded and the paperwork was filed, Sarah Martinez found herself free to go home and resume her quiet civilian life. But the incident at the shopping center had reminded her that transitioning from military service to civilian life involved challenges she hadn't anticipated. She had successfully defended herself against 2 attackers, but in doing so, she had revealed capabilities that were supposed to remain hidden. The careful anonymity she had tried to maintain since her discharge was now compromised, and she would have to decide how to handle the attention that would inevitably follow. 3 days after the incident at Westfield Shopping Center, Sarah Martinez sat in the sterile conference room of a downtown Seattle office building, facing 2 men in expensive suits who had introduced themselves only as Representatives Smith and Johnson from the Department of Defense. They had contacted her within hours of Detective Rodriguez's inquiry into her service record, and their presence confirmed what Sarah had feared. Her carefully maintained civilian anonymity was over. Ms. Martinez, Representative Smith began, consulting a thick file folder that contained what appeared to be her complete military record. We understand you were involved in an incident that required you to use force against civilian attackers. Sarah studied both men with the same analytical approach she had learned to apply to potential threats during her military service. Smith was approximately 50 years old, graying at the temples, with the bearing of someone accustomed to authority. Johnson was younger, possibly mid-30s, and carried himself with the alert tension of active military personnel, though he wore no uniform. I defended myself against two men who attempted to assault me, Sarah replied carefully. I used the minimum force necessary to neutralize the threat. According to the police report, you inflicted significant injuries on both attackers using techniques that clearly indicated advanced combat training, Johnson observed. The local authorities are asking questions about your background that we'd prefer not to answer. Sarah understood the implication. Her involvement in a civilian incident had created a potential security risk. If her true identity and service record became public knowledge, it could compromise ongoing operations or put other special operations personnel at risk. What do you need from me? She asked directly. Smith leaned forward, his expression becoming more serious. We need to discuss your transition to civilian life and whether additional support might be beneficial for both you and national security interests. The conversation that followed revealed the extent to which Sarah's case had attracted attention at the highest levels of the military establishment. Her service record included participation in operations that remained classified years after their completion. She had been involved in missions that had prevented terrorist attacks, rescued American hostages, and eliminated threats to national security that the public would never know about. Ms. Martinez, Smith continued, you are one of only 3 women to have completed the full Navy SEAL training program. Your service record includes commendations for valor, multiple Purple Hearts, and participation in operations that have shaped American foreign policy for the past 2 decades. I'm aware of my service record, Sarah replied dryly. What concerns us is that someone with your capabilities and knowledge is now operating without institutional support, Johnson explained. The incident at the shopping center demonstrates that your training remains intact, but it also shows that you're encountering situations where that training becomes relevant. Sarah was beginning to understand where this conversation was heading. The military had invested millions of dollars in her training and 2 decades in developing her capabilities. From their perspective, she represented a significant national security asset that was now operating independently in civilian society. The men who attacked you, Smith said, opening another file, weren't random criminals. Marcus Webb and Derek Coleman have connections to a larger organization that specializes in human trafficking. They were specifically targeting women who fit a certain profile for abduction and sale to overseas buyers. This information was new to Sarah, and it changed her understanding of what had happened to the shopping center. What she had interpreted as a simple assault attempt was actually part of a more sophisticated criminal operation. Detective Rodriguez's investigation uncovered evidence that Webb and Coleman had been operating in the Seattle area for several months. Johnson continued. They had successfully abducted at least 3 other women before attempting to target you. Sarah felt a surge of anger as she processed this information. While she had been congratulating herself on successful self-defense, 3 other women had been victims of the same criminals. If she had been more aware of their pattern, if she had recognized the signs earlier, those women might have been saved. Where are those women now? She asked. Smith's expression darkened. 2 were recovered alive from a trafficking operation based in Vancouver. The 3rd hasn't been found. The weight of this revelation settled over Sarah like a familiar burden. During her military service, she had carried responsibility for the lives of her teammates and the success of national security missions. She had thought that retiring from active duty would free her from such responsibilities, but apparently the skills and instincts that made her an effective SEAL continued to attract situations where those capabilities were needed. What exactly are you proposing? Sarah asked. Johnson slid a document across the table toward her. We'd like to offer you a consulting position with a joint task force that targets domestic criminal organizations with international connections. Your skills would be invaluable in operations against human trafficking, drug cartels, and terrorist cells operating on American soil. Sarah examined the document, which outlined a position that would allow her to maintain her civilian status while providing specialized services to various government agencies. The pay was substantial, the work would be meaningful, and it would allow her to use her training in service of protecting American citizens. This is about more than just a shopping center incident, she observed. Smith nodded. We've been monitoring your transition to civilian life, and, frankly, we're We're concerned about the waste of resources represented by having someone with your capabilities working as a private security consultant. You've been monitoring me? Sarah's voice carried a dangerous edge that both men recognized. Standard procedure for personnel with your level of clearance and training, Johnson explained quickly. We need to ensure that classified information and capabilities don't fall into the wrong hands. Sarah understood the logic, but she didn't appreciate learning that her privacy had been an illusion since her discharge. However, the revelation about the trafficking operation and the missing woman weighed heavily on her conscience. If accepting this position could prevent other women from becoming victims, then it might be worth sacrificing the quiet civilian life she had been trying to build. I need details about the missing woman, she said. Smith consulted another file. Jennifer Walsh, 24 years old, graduate student at the University of Washington, disappeared 6 weeks ago after leaving a coffee shop near campus. No witnesses, no surveillance footage, no trace evidence. Local police have classified it as a missing person case. But you think Webb and Coleman were involved? Phone records show Coleman made several calls to numbers associated with the trafficking network around the time of Walsh's disappearance, Johnson explained. We believe she was their first successful abduction in the Seattle area. Sarah studied the photograph of Jennifer Walsh that was included in the file. She was young, attractive, and fit the profile that traffickers typically targeted. Alone, no family in the area, and following predictable routines that made surveillance easy. If I accept this position, Sarah asked, would finding Jennifer Walsh be part of my responsibilities? It would be a priority, Smith confirmed. The trafficking network operates across state and national borders, making it a federal jurisdiction matter. Your background makes you uniquely qualified to infiltrate and disrupt their operations. The moral calculus was clear to Sarah. She could continue trying to build a peaceful civilian life while knowing that her unique skills might have saved Jennifer Walsh and could prevent future abductions. Or she could accept that her capabilities came with responsibilities that transcended her personal desires for normalcy. I'll need complete operational autonomy, Sarah said. I choose my own methods, my own timeline, and my own backup. I won't work within a bureaucracy that might compromise mission effectiveness for political considerations. Johnson looked uncomfortable with these terms, but Smith nodded slowly. Given your track record and the sensitive nature of these operations, I think we can accommodate those requirements. And I want full access to all intelligence related to this trafficking network. No compartmentalization, no need-to-know restrictions. If I'm going after these people, I need to understand the complete scope of their operations. Agreed, Smith said, making notes in his file. Sarah spent the next hour reviewing additional details about the trafficking network and the specific operations that would fall under her purview. The organization was more sophisticated than typical street-level criminals, with connections to international syndicates and enough resources to operate across multiple states. One more thing, Sarah said as the meeting concluded. I want to handle Webb and Coleman personally. They're in federal custody awaiting trial, Johnson explained. Any interrogation would need to follow established protocols. Sarah's smile was cold and professional. I didn't say anything about interrogation. These men attempted to abduct and assault me. They're responsible for the disappearance of at least 3 women, one of whom is still missing. I think a personal conversation about their associates would be beneficial. Smith and Johnson exchanged glances, recognizing the implications of Sarah's request. They had read her complete service record, including the classified sections that detailed her methods for extracting information from captured enemy personnel. That can be arranged, Smith said finally. When would you like to begin? Sarah stood up, her decision made. Tomorrow. And, gentlemen, I want to be very clear about something. I accepted this position to save lives and protect innocent people. If bureaucratic interference prevents me from accomplishing those objectives, our arrangement will be terminated immediately. As she left the conference room and walked out into the Seattle afternoon, Sarah Martinez reflected on how quickly her life had changed. 3 days ago, she had been a retired veteran trying to buy clothes for a family wedding. Now she was back in the service of her country, hunting criminals who preyed on vulnerable women. The transition hadn't been as difficult as she had expected. In fact, she felt more centered and purposeful than she had since her discharge from active duty. Her skills and training had found their proper application, and she was once again part of something larger than herself. Jennifer Walsh was still missing, and Sarah intended to find her. The trafficking network that had taken her would soon discover that they had inadvertently triggered a response they were completely unprepared to handle. Sarah Martinez was back in action, and she was very good at what she did. 2 weeks after accepting her new position with the Joint Task Force, Sarah Martinez stood in the shadows outside a warehouse in the industrial district of Tacoma, watching a complex criminal operation unfold before her. The intelligence she had extracted from Marcus Webb and Derek Coleman during their conversation at the federal detention facility had led her to this moment. The rescue of Jennifer Walsh and the dismantling of the trafficking network that had terrorized the Pacific Northwest for over a year. The interrogation of Webb and Coleman had been professionally conducted within the bounds of federal law, but Sarah's presence and reputation had encouraged both men to be remarkably forthcoming about their associates and operations. When someone with Sarah's background asked questions about missing women, even hardened criminals found themselves eager to cooperate. The information they provided had painted a picture of a sophisticated organization that operated like a military unit, with careful planning, disciplined communication, and multiple backup plans for every operation. They transported victims through a network of safe houses that stretched from Seattle to the Canadian border, using legitimate businesses as fronts and corrupted officials to avoid law enforcement scrutiny. Jennifer Walsh was being held at this warehouse facility, along with at least 6 other women who had been abducted from locations throughout Washington and Oregon. The trafficking network was preparing to transport them to Vancouver, where they would be loaded onto a cargo ship bound for Southeast Asia. Once they left American soil, the chances of rescue would become virtually zero. Sarah had spent the past week conducting surveillance of the warehouse and mapping the criminal organization structure. She had identified 12 active members of the trafficking ring, 3 vehicles used for transportation, and the communication methods they used to coordinate their operations. Most importantly, she had confirmed that Jennifer Walsh was alive and being held on the 2nd floor of the warehouse. The local FBI field office had wanted to conduct a traditional raid with overwhelming force and multiple tactical teams. Sarah had vetoed that approach, knowing that it would likely result in the execution of the hostages before law enforcement could reach them. Instead, she had developed a plan that would neutralize the guards, secure the hostages, and capture the leadership of the trafficking network alive for interrogation. At exactly 2:17 a.m., Sarah began her infiltration of the warehouse. The building was a 3-story concrete structure that had been abandoned by its original owner and purchased by the trafficking network through a series of shell companies. The first floor contained loading docks and storage areas where legitimate cargo was processed to maintain the cover story. The second floor held the kidnapped women in makeshift cells. The third floor served as living quarters for the guards and administrative offices for the criminal operation. Sarah's approach to the building was silent and invisible. 20 years of special operations training had taught her to move through hostile territory without leaving any trace of her presence. She avoided the obvious entry points that would be watched by security cameras or guards, instead choosing a route that took advantage of blind spots and structural weaknesses in the building's design. The first guard she encountered was patrolling the loading dock area, walking a predictable pattern that suggested boredom rather than alertness. Sarah waited until he reached the furthest point of his patrol route, then moved behind him with the fluid silence of a predator. Her approach was so quiet that he never knew she was there until her arm wrapped around his throat in a chokehold that rendered him unconscious in less than 10 seconds. She secured the unconscious guard with zip ties and continued deeper into the warehouse. The building's layout matched the intelligence she had gathered through surveillance, with the main staircase located at the center of the structure and additional emergency exits at each corner. The lighting was minimal, which worked in her favor since she had trained extensively for night operations. The second guard was stationed at the bottom of the main staircase, positioned to control access to the upper floors where the hostages were held. Unlike the first guard, this man was alert and armed with a pistol that he kept ready in his hand. Sarah studied his position for several minutes, noting his field of view and the cover available in the immediate area. Her approach required patience and precision. She moved through the warehouse using the stored cargo as concealment, gradually working her way closer to the guard's position without entering his line of sight. When she was within striking distance, she created a distraction by tossing a small piece of debris to his left, causing him to turn and investigate the sound. The moment his attention was diverted, Sarah struck with lethal efficiency. Her hand clamped over his mouth to prevent any sound, while her other arm applied pressure to his carotid artery. The guard struggled briefly, but lost consciousness before he could raise an alarm or use his weapon. With the ground floor secured, Sarah began her ascent to the second floor, where the hostages were being held. Intelligence indicated that there were 2 guards on this level, positioned outside the makeshift cell area to prevent any escape attempts. The staircase was wooden and potentially noisy, so Sarah moved slowly and distributed her weight carefully to avoid creaking sounds that might alert the guards above. The second floor layout was exactly as described by Webb and Coleman during their interrogation. A long hallway stretched the length of the building, with several rooms on each side that had been converted into holding cells. At the far end of the hallway, 2 guards sat playing cards at a small table, their weapons within easy reach but not immediately ready for use. Sarah could hear voices from the cells, quiet conversations between the hostages, some crying, and what sounded like someone trying to comfort the others. The sound filled her with a cold anger that she channeled into focused determination. These women had been terrorized and traumatized by criminals who saw them as nothing more than merchandise to be sold to the highest bidder. Her attack on the 2 guards was swift and simultaneous. She approached from the side hallway where shadows concealed her movement, then struck both men before either could react to her presence. The first guard went down from a precise blow to his temple that rendered him immediately unconscious. The second guard had time to reach for his weapon, but not time to use it before Sarah's combat training took effect. Within 30 seconds, both guards were unconscious and secured with zip ties. Sarah moved quickly to the cells, finding 7 women in varying states of physical and emotional distress. Jennifer Walsh was in the 3rd cell, recognizable from the photograph in her file, but showing the effects of weeks of captivity and psychological trauma. "Jennifer," Sarah whispered, kneeling beside the terrified young woman. "I'm here to get you out. My name is Sarah, and I work with the government. You're going to be okay." Jennifer's eyes were wide with fear and confusion, but she nodded her understanding. The other women gathered around Sarah, some crying with relief at the prospect of rescue, others too traumatized to fully comprehend what was happening. "Listen to me carefully," Sarah told the group. "We're going to leave this building together, but you need to follow my instructions exactly. Stay quiet, stay together, and do what I tell you to do." Sarah had planned for this phase of the operation as carefully as the infiltration. She knew that moving 7 traumatized women through a hostile environment would be exponentially more difficult than operating alone. But her experience in rescue operations had taught her how to manage civilian evacuees under dangerous conditions. The evacuation route took them down the back staircase to an emergency exit that Sarah had identified during her surveillance. She had disabled the alarm system for this exit earlier in the evening, and the route avoided the areas where additional guards might be stationed. As they reached the ground floor, Sarah's radio crackled with a prearranged signal from the FBI tactical team that was positioned around the warehouse perimeter. The signal indicated that federal agents had moved into position and were ready to begin their portion of the operation. "This is Control," Sarah whispered into her radio. "Package secured. 7 souls. Ready for extraction." "Copy that, Control. Extraction team moving to your position." Sarah guided the rescued women through the emergency exit and into the custody of FBI agents who were waiting with medical personnel and victim advocates. As the women were led to safety, Sarah prepared for the final phase of her mission, the capture of the trafficking network's leadership. Intelligence indicated that the organization's local commander, a man named Viktor Kozlov, was on the third floor of the warehouse with at least 3 additional guards. Kozlov was responsible for coordinating trafficking operations throughout the Pacific Northwest and possessed information about similar networks operating in other parts of the country. Sarah's assault on the third floor was more direct than her previous infiltrations. With the hostages secured and the FBI team in position, stealth was less important than speed and decisive action. She moved up the main staircase quickly, using her remaining element of surprise to maximum advantage. The first guard she encountered was positioned at the top of the staircase, apparently serving as a lookout while his associates conducted business in the administrative offices. He had time to see Sarah approaching, but not time to react effectively before her training took effect. Within seconds, he was unconscious and no longer a factor in the operation. The second and third guards were in a conference room with Viktor Kozlov, apparently discussing transportation logistics for their human cargo. Sarah could hear their voices through the partially open door as she approached their position. Her entry into the room was explosive and overwhelming. She disabled both guards before they could draw their weapons and had Kozlov on the ground with his hands secured behind his back before he fully understood what was happening. "Viktor Kozlov," Sarah said, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to dealing with captured enemies. "You're under arrest for human trafficking, kidnapping, and conspiracy." Kozlov was a heavy-set man in his 50s with the cold eyes of someone who had spent years treating human beings as commodities. He stared at Sarah with a mixture of fear and confusion, clearly unable to understand how his operation had been compromised so completely. "You don't know what you're doing," he said in accented English. "You have no idea who you're messing with." Sarah's smile was cold and professional. "I know exactly who I'm messing with. And, more importantly, I know exactly what I'm doing." The FBI tactical team swept through the warehouse over the next hour, securing evidence and ensuring that no additional criminals or hostages were present in the building. The operation had been executed without casualties among the hostages or law enforcement personnel, and the entire leadership of the trafficking network was in federal custody. As dawn broke over the industrial district of Tacoma, Sarah Martinez stood outside the warehouse watching as the rescued women were transported to medical facilities for evaluation and treatment. Jennifer Walsh had been reunited with her family, and the other victims were beginning the long process of recovery from their ordeal. The trafficking network that had operated with impunity for over a year had been completely dismantled. Evidence seized from the warehouse would lead to the identification and arrest of associates throughout the Pacific Northwest and beyond. The criminal organization that had caused so much suffering had been eliminated. 3 months later, Sarah received a letter from Jennifer Walsh, who had returned to her graduate studies at the University of Washington. The letter was simple and direct, thanking Sarah for her rescue and expressing gratitude for the chance to rebuild her life. Jennifer had no idea of the classified details of Sarah's background or the full scope of her capabilities, but she understood that her life had been saved by someone extraordinary. Sarah kept the letter in the same frame as her retirement flag and SEAL team photograph. It served as a reminder that her skills and training had found their proper purpose in civilian life, protecting innocent people from those who would do them harm. The transition from military service to civilian life had been more complex than she had expected, but she had discovered that serving her country could take many different forms. The incident at the shopping center that had started this chapter of her life seemed like ancient history now. 2 criminals had made the mistake of targeting the wrong woman, and that mistake had ultimately led to the rescue of 7 human trafficking victims and the dismantling of an international criminal network. Sarah Martinez had successfully transitioned from Navy SEAL to civilian protector, and she had never been more satisfied with her choice of profession. Some skills were too valuable to retire, and some responsibilities transcended the boundaries between military and civilian life. She would continue to serve, in her own way, as long as there were people who needed protection and criminals who underestimated the consequences of their actions.